It's episode 10 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM.
It's only when we moved here that I thought, I've got quite a long commute. It's 40, 50 minutes, sometimes over an hour. And I wanted to listen to a podcast about the area. And I looked for one and there wasn't one. So I thought, there isn't a podcast for Ramsbottom. Why don't I create one?
And 90 episodes later, Lee Ball is still producing This Is Rammy, the local podcast for Ramsbottom in the UK. Hi, I'm Jason Norris, the host and producer of Podcast Local, the show that shines a spotlight on the podcasters who are telling the stories of their community. Previously on Podcast Local, I've interviewed local podcasters in large cities. Jackson, Mississippi and Salt Lake City have about 200,000 people each living within their city limits. New Orleans has a population of nearly 400,000, and San Antonio has about 1.5 million people. Now, you might be thinking local podcasts could only be successful in very large cities. Lee Ball would disagree. Ramsbottom is a small town, geographically and in terms of population. But Lee has been podcasting for his community for nearly 2 years and for nearly 100 episodes. His award-winning local podcast, This Is Rammy, is successful, but perhaps in ways you've never considered. This conversation might challenge some assumptions you have about local podcasting, but I also hope it makes you think differently about your own podcast. And if you have never thought you could make a podcast for your community, then I hope Lee's story will inspire you. Support for Podcast Local comes from the Satchel Podcast Player with a cool local feature. Find out more at satchelplayer.com. So when I started researching This Is Rammy, Ramsbottom, and host Lee Ball, I came across a site with a different name. And of course, when it comes to facts, and especially names, you want to get it right. So let's just clarify, your name is Lee Ball, right?
Lee Ball is my name, yeah.
So can you explain this website that is listed on your Twitter profile? Who is Lee Nukes?
Lee Nukes, yeah. So early on, when I was first looking for a website to create, this would have been maybe 2002 or something like that. Obviously, my background's in IT, and at the time, even still to this day, I kind of spend more time on Linux. And if you're not familiar with Linux, it's a free open source operating system. And some people have said that the way it is pronounced is Linux or Linux.
Ah, okay.
So that's kind of where that came from, because my name is Lee. I was working with Linux, and it was something that in my 18, 19-year-old head thought, that's a good idea for a website, that. So that kind of stuck. And so that's where that comes from.
So your actually name, though, Lee Ball.
Lee Ball is my name, yeah.
Okay. All right. That's interesting. Why is your town called Ramsbottom?
There are two apparent reasons if you look into it. One of them is that there is a plant which is the wild garlic. Its proper name is ramson, and it does grow quite well around here. So every year you'll go out and pick. You can go out and pick wild garlic. So I've picked it locally and came back and I've cooked it and things, and I'm still alive. So clearly I knew what I was doing. But they say that it's because it's in a valley, it's the bottom of the valley. So it was Ramson. It's like Valley of the Ramson, so Ram's Bottom. Also, there is a belief that when it was in Saxon periods or maybe even the Iron Age, it was quite well known for storing sheep and things in and around the area. So you're in the bottom of the valley. There's sheep here. That's basically as deep as that goes.
So you call your show "This Is Rammy"? Is that a common?
Yeah, that's like a colloquialism. So you will get people saying, I'm from Rammy, because to say Ramsbottom is quite. It's not that it's a mouthful. It's just if you're saying it quite a lot, then you kind of do want to shorten it down. For example, if you're from Birmingham, you would say you're a Brummie, Brumie, and it tends to be a lot of the, I don't know why it is, but you tend to end things with an IE or a Y when you like shortening them around here and turning them into like little phrases and things. So yeah, you'll get people that saying that they're from Rammy, and most people know where that is.
Being in the United States, we kind of are familiar with the things in our country, but when you start to think about anything else in the world, it's really hard to picture sometimes. So I wonder if you could just describe Ramsbottom. Where do you live?
So Ramsbottom is it's about 3 miles north of a town called Bury, and Bury itself is a town which is probably about another 3 or 4 miles north of what most people have probably heard of, which is Manchester. So that's the biggest town that biggest city that we're near is Manchester, and we're kind of to the west of Ramsbottom and Bury would be Liverpool. So Liverpool is out on the coast on the west. So we're about, if you were to divide England or the UK up into like thirds or quarters, in fact, we'd be the top 2 quarters in that section there. And the town itself we're set on the side of a mountain. Well, not a mountain, it's a hill, and it's called Holcombe Hill. And the scenery it's very green, and essentially Ramsbottom is an old mill town. So when all of the cotton mills and things like that and the Industrial Revolution hit Manchester, we had a very large cotton industry as well as a paper industry, because it seems that a lot of the mills that made cotton also made paper, because I think from what I did some research into it, and originally the paper was actually made from like cotton, like very fine cotton. So that's what we had a lot of around here. So you'll find a lot of big buildings that are made of stone and things of a similar type. There's a building just a few houses up from me, which is from like 1819, I think it is, or something like that. It's fairly common for people around here to be living in houses that were from like the 1800s.
Wow!
Just because they were built so large and from bricks that are so big that they're still around today. And you will tend to find that they're listed buildings, which means that you can't really make many changes to them. And Ramsbottom itself is in what's known as a conservation area, so that kind of has a lot of restrictions on what you can do with regards to changes to your house. So we're currently going through, we've gone through planning permission, and we're trying to put a small extension onto the side of our roof on our house for another bedroom, because we do have another child on the way in August.
Oh, wow.
So we're going to get very busy.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you very much. But yeah, so we went through a lot of planning permission for that. We had to go through 3 times, basically reducing the size. And it is quite, you have to try and keep things in keeping of the area. So it's very hilly. You get a lot of people here who do cycling and dog walking and walks. And you'll find there's a lot of like what we call estates. So they're like little, don't know if you've got like the term of a cul-de-sac in America, which is essentially it's a road that goes down, and then you'll have houses on each side, and at the end it's just like a ring of houses. And that's it. You have to then turn around at the bottom and come back out again. You can't pass through it. So you get a lot of those in Ramsbottom, little nooks and crannies where they've shoved quite a lot of houses into one small area. And then in between that, you've got like little wooded areas. It's not a very big town. It's probably only, I think it's about 2 square miles or something like that, 2 or 3 square miles.
That's interesting. So just a couple of miles, so you don't have to travel very far to get to any of the stories you really want to cover.
Exactly, yeah. And in fact, so there was an interview I did with someone that was literally just around the corner from me. I did take my car because I was taking my recording kit, and the wind was blowing like 25 mile an hour winds here, so I didn't really want to take off. But I drove round, and it was about a 2-minute drive just from door to door. Unpacked all my kit and went into his office and did a half-an-hour interview there with someone that does motivational speaking, and he found me. So he reached out to me. He found me through somebody else that I'd interviewed previously who has a running club, and I tend to find that a lot of the people that I'll interview, they either know each other or they've got a local business, and I've reached out to them. But now, interview-wise, it tends to be that a lot more people know of the podcast, of This Is Rammy and the website and things. So it's a lot easier for me to reach out to people to be on the podcast now than what it used to be. Originally, it was quite difficult to try and tell people what a podcast is, let alone who I am and what they're expected to do if I turn up.
So This Is Rammy, is this your first podcast?
Yeah, first podcast. Not the first website, but yeah, it's my first podcast. I'd always wanted to do a podcast. The first podcasts I was listening to were like Security Now, which is one that Leo Laporte does with Steve Gibson, which is like a tech security podcast. And that's kind of my background, IT, and I mean, it still is my background now. So I've been in IT for like 10 and 15 years. It was just, I never really got the concept of podcast at the time because I didn't have iTunes and things like that. And I always thought, well, that's what you need. So I used to just download those separately and play them from my phone. And then my wife got me an internet radio, like a Bush wireless internet radio. And I just have that in the kitchen. And so I was just scrolling through the channels. And one of them was the Twit network, which previously I didn't realize he had a network. I knew him from Security Now, and that was kind of the thing I listened to. And then, so I found the Twit network and I thought, oh, great, there's just streaming these things all the time. So the shows I got to listen to were kind of dictated by my schedule around that radio because I was just literally treating it like a radio. I would turn it on, it would connect to the internet, and then I would load up my favorite feeds and listen to whatever was on at the time. And it was that kind of got me thinking, all right, these are great. I wish I had, something that was live like this because it was pretty cool. It was like having, it's like having your own radio station. And what I'd always done as a kid, I'd record myself trying to be the host of a radio show and things, and play it back on tapes and things like that. And I'd have like a record playing and things and basically just playing DJ. And it was listening to the Leo Laporte podcast, basically, that got me into wanting to have a podcast, but I never had other than tech and IT, I never really had anything that I could give. And then I started the website for This Is Rammy because we were going to be moving to the area and looking for news and information about what's going on in the town was quite difficult because either the websites were not very well updated or they were kind of one-sided. So you'd have like the business group website, which was telling you all about the events and things that were going on with your business group. And then there was a few Facebook groups as well. And it was kind of spread out quite a lot. So originally I just wanted to create a blog that was about life in Ramsbottom, news and things going on around Ramsbottom because there didn't seem to be much there. And then it's only when we moved here that I thought, I've got quite a long commute. It's 40, 50 minutes, sometimes over an hour. And I wanted to listen to a podcast about the area or nearby because I was now listening to a large variety of podcasts. I'd moved away from the internet radio, and so I was listening to podcasts on my commute anyway. And I looked for one, and there wasn't one. So I thought, oh well, there isn't a podcast for Ramsbottom. Why don't I create one? So then I spent probably about 1 or 2 months looking into it. I bought myself a microphone off eBay. Had a couple of goes at putting a podcast together. I created a feed on another website I've got just to see how it all hangs together. And then I kind of just launched with it in March 2015. And 90 episodes in now. And I've more or less kept weekly. There has been a few gaps where things have happened, like it's been Christmas. I might have taken like a couple of weeks off, or there's been a couple of times where it's been fortnightly. That's another term that you don't tend to have in America too much. Bi-weekly or something, I think is the equivalent. So yeah, every 2 weeks I was releasing them at one time. But yeah, it's this so far this year. My commitment is to get one out every week, and so far I've managed to do that.
Well, that's cool. Now, I wonder if you could clarify something for me. Were you working in Ramsbottom before you moved?
No. So basically, we had friends who already lived in Ramsbottom, and we'd been here a few times for like parties and just visiting them at their house. Mm-hmm. And we'd got to the point in our lives because me and my wife, we were living in Salford, which is like southwest Manchester. But that's much bigger. It's like a city. It is a city itself, actually, and it's probably the biggest city that's attached to Manchester. And that's where we lived. I'd lived there for 11 years in the same house, and now we were at the point in our lives where we'd got a 1-year-old child, and we were looking at schools and things, and basically where we wanted to raise our family. And essentially the answer was we didn't really want to raise our child in Salford, especially as there had been an increase in gun crime, which is not really something that you tend to get a lot of in the UK. And I mean, even when we were selling our house, the landlord of the pub at the end of the road, he was shot with a semi-automatic machine gun. So that was kind of the obvious sign that we really should be moving. Although we'd never really had any trouble ourselves. But yeah, so we looked at various options and where we could afford, and we knew people who lived in Ramsbottom. We didn't really have any nearby family. They're all like 4 and 5 hour commutes, drives at least. And so we thought, well, we'll move to Ramsbottom. We've got friends here already. And so we ended up, we did sell the house, and we moved at October 2014. And then I'd been doing the website for a couple of months at that point, which I'd kind of just started to create more content for. And yeah, I started the podcast, what would it be, 5 months later?
Wow, very soon after moving to a new place.
Yeah, well, that was part of the reason for it. Part of the incentive was that I knew that there were lots of things going on around the town. There were lots of different groups. There was a group called Incredible Edible, which was started just up the road in a neighbouring village. But Incredible Edible, they are a group of people they're all volunteers. They just take their own time to do it. And they're like guerrilla gardeners. So they will find plots of land around towns and things like that is not currently being used, and they will grow edible food on it. So like tomatoes, strawberries, various vegetables and things, and it's there for the community. So you can just turn up and pick it yourself, and just pick what you need is essentially the term of that. Right. And that's just there for all community. So there's a lot of little groups like that I wanted to get involved with, and I wanted to get involved with the community of Ramsbottom, because there's a very tight knit community in Ramsbottom. There's a lot of like friendships running underneath the town itself, and this is one of the things I was told before we moved to Ramsbottom, was that it could be quite difficult to feel welcome. And that was the other reason for doing the website and the podcast, was that I wanted to feel that I was putting myself out there and getting involved with the community more, because as far as I'm concerned, this is the town that we've decided to move to settle down with, and I wanted the town to continue to be the town that we saw when we moved here. So it was kind of my way of trying to ensure that these good things continue to happen, and my way of contributing was going to various groups, interviewing the people of them, and just finding out more about the area. And since doing the podcast, I've made lots and lots of friends here from various groups and things like that, and through the podcast itself. And yeah, if I see them out and about in the town, then I know them enough to say hello and stop and talk and things, which is nice, because we never really had that in Salford where we were living. And that's kind of, the podcast has achieved one of the goals for me originally, and that's kind of as far as I thought about it at the beginning, was get talking to people and get more of a sense of community for myself. So that was my selfish scratch your own itch part of that.
And what is the population of Ramsbottom?
It's probably, so for the whole of Ramsbottom, if you're to look on like Wikipedia or something like that, they say around about 17,000. But that's largely due to, depends on where you class Ramsbottom, because there's quite a few towns like quite closely nestled to each other. I would say there's probably about 10,000 people in the main Ramsbottom centre itself. So there's a few large housing estates, and they're probably like 3 and 5 bedroom houses. So they've got obviously like 3 or 4 people in them, and there's a few hundred of those houses. So just to calculate from that, I would say there's probably around about 10,000 people. When I started the podcast, I thought, is there enough going on in Ramsbottom to kind of do a weekly podcast? And so at the beginning I said Ramsbottom and the surrounding area, because I just didn't know how much was going on. So I kind of give myself a get out clause from the start, which was like, if I am struggling to find things that are going on here, then I've always got the opportunity to go further afield. Because Bury is, I mean, that's probably only got 1 million people in it or something. But I haven't needed to. There's always been something going on, and I wouldn't even know where to start with a podcast about an area the sizes that you're talking about, because I mean, I guess my remit here is I kind of want to get a good cross section of the community. I want to have quite a lot of different interviews for the Ramsbottom area. So that could be, for example, that person that does conferences. I've interviewed artists. I've interviewed a local business group. I've interviewed local restaurant owners, people that run local charities and things like that. And I kind of want to have that variety of people. I don't want to just do the businesses of Ramsbottom, because I think it'll get quite stale. And although I would like people to listen every week, I don't think everybody actually will, because I still, the majority of the people that listen to the podcast is from the website. So they'll go to the website, they'll see there's a new release, and they'll listen to the episode straight on there. So I'm not too worried that people are dipping in and out and liking listening to the episodes that they like. For example, the one I just did had more downloads for that one episode than my last one did all week, and that was just in one day. And I think it just depends of the subject matter. So there is an interview, or there's a local restaurant here that is very popular. It's very difficult to get a table in there because it's quite small anyway. It's probably only 8 meters wide by about 30 meters or 40 meters long. So it's quite a small restaurant, and there must only be about 10 or 15 tables. And it was recently listed in the Times top 100 restaurants in the UK, and you tend to get a lot of that near here. You'll get a lot of restaurants winning awards, because that's kind of what Ramsbottom started to get known for, is really good quality restaurants. So you'll get a lot of people coming here instead of Manchester, or they'll go to Manchester as well, but it's not too far on public transport, but it's not the easiest place to get to from Manchester directly. If you were to go on a night out in Manchester, or get on a plane and land in Manchester, for example, the way you would probably get here is a tram, which is like a bit like a subway, to Bury, and then from Bury you could actually get the steam train, because we do have a working steam train here, which is run by volunteers, and that's not generally used for commuting or for general transport. It's more of a luxury kind of way to get around, because it's like £8 per ticket for an adult. Children under 5 are free, but if you just nip into the shops, like spending £16 on transport on the train is a little bit rich, really. So you wouldn't tend to do that. But getting the bus is about £4, £4.50. So sometimes getting the steam train is it's a nice change. We've got one big motorway which is near us, the M66, which is currently apparently going to get turned into what we seem to be turning the whole of the UK into, which is smart motorways. And it basically means that there are cameras on every bridge. So if they turn the speed signs down to 50 miles an hour, for example, then if you travel over that, you will get caught and you'll get a speeding ticket sent to you automatically. Okay. Yeah. So we've got those getting built at the moment. In addition to that, the ones that are being built, we've got what's known as average speed zones. So the whole of the M60, which is like a big ring road, it goes around the whole of the outside of Manchester. That is on this average speed check. So you have to drive at 50 miles an hour. If you drive slightly over, then they work out the average between the cameras, when the last camera saw you and the latest one, and then you'll get a speeding ticket for that as well.
So these are just sort of automatically delivered to you at that point?
Yep. So if you get caught, your number plate is recognised and they post it to your house, and that's kind of it.
Wow. That's fascinating. It's interesting technologically speaking. I guess it's got to be frustrating though as you're driving.
Yeah. You have to be really being alert, because if you don't pay attention and realise that I'm in this average speed check zone, you'll just be in automatic pilot, like, I'm on the motorway, it's great. And, I can travel at 70 miles an hour. No, you can't, not through this zone. Usually it's okay because there's other cars there. And then you think, why are you travelling so slow? And then you go, yeah, that's why. So usually you don't get too far until you correct your speed. and fix it. So.
And you said that's smart
motorways.
Smart motorways.
I guess the equivalent would be smart highways. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Apparently, they're supposed to ease congestion, but there is always the question mark of, are you actually just using it to tax everybody and get extra money through that? So we'll see how it works.
You had an episode on that. I don't think I listened to the whole thing. Did you get into all those details?
I guess I glossed over it a little bit. I kind of just, because it's kind of common knowledge. That's the problem I have with the podcast, is I'm trying to appeal to the locals, and I don't want to labour the point too much. So I don't want to, for example, say, go into all of the nitty gritty about things. And that is something that I've been told in the past. So I've had the podcast reviewed, and that is something I've been told in the past, that it would be good if I could just elaborate a little bit more and describe things a little bit more. So that is I need to do that more. That is one of the actions I've got. But yeah, I did talk about the smart motorway. The M66 is the next one on the list, and it feels a bit like that they're just finishing the M60 and they're going to be doing the M66, which directly connects to the M60. So it feels like they're just moving the trucks and the diggers down a little bit. I think someone's just did a very good sales tactic and sold them to the next motorway along, so they can make that one as well.
Do you ever dive into controversial topics?
I try to avoid them where possible, because on the one hand, I do think that it makes quite good listening for the person that's not involved with that particular story. For example, the two closest things to controversy that I've covered would be you're probably familiar with it. I don't know if you've got it near you, but there's a term of fracking. So
yes, we definitely have that here.
Yeah, so there's basically we voted to say no to fracking in Lancashire, which is like the big area where it includes like Manchester and Ramsbottom and a lot of other areas as well, and Liverpool and things. And we've voted to say no to fracking here, and then the government overturned it. So it's like, it doesn't really matter what you do. And so there's a lot of people that were very upset about that. And there was a local anti-fracking group that was created here. There was talk of, because it's like a green area, there was talk of them fracking a lot of the land around us. So there was a lot of that. And that's, for that episode, I did my research. So it's difficult to try and stay on the fence with that when it seems so obviously bad that the only reason that they're doing it is to extract the money out of the ground, because that is now an easier way of getting access to gas and things like that. So yeah, so that's a little bit controversial. Other than that, there was a local business that wanted to build an anaerobic digestion facility, so basically recycling food waste to turn it into energy, which sounds like a fantastic thing. However, when you consider that the place they wanted to put it was on top of one of the biggest hills in Ramsbottom, and Ramsbottom is a valley, all of the smells and the gas and things like that would have came down into the town. In addition to that, there was going to be a lot more trucks on the road bringing in all of that material. So I think we spent about 3 years or thereabouts fighting it. So went through various courts, and I think it got as far as the High Court, and then it was basically said no, and they said, okay, right, we're not going to do it. But yeah, that's probably as close to controversy I get, really. I try to avoid it.
So you wouldn't necessarily want to cover the government and everything that is coming through there? Yeah,
not really. I mean, I'll because the town of Ramsbottom is currently governed by a Tory. Well, the whole of the UK is currently governed by a Tory leader. The Prime Minister is a Tory, so that's a Conservative Party member. And each of our areas around England is divided up into different parties. So a lot of people can vote for what you want your local MP to be it a Labour Party member or a Tory member or one of the other parties like Green and things like that. And so even though you've got a Prime Minister who is one member of a party, you can actually have your area is actually managed by this other party. The MP for Ramsbottom is a Tory person, and the previous year as well, it's also been a Tory person. So it's a very traditionally a Tory area, which would be classed as, if you were the traditional view is that the Labour Party is more like a party for the people, and the Tory Party is more like a party for the landowners and the more well-off people. And it tends to be that is what has repeated itself. So you'll find a lot of times when Labour come in, you'll find that they will increase welfare. And then when Tory come in, they take it away. And that's kind of seems to be what it is. This is back and forth all the time. So although on the one hand, I would sometimes like to say more about it, I usually just do it tongue-in-cheek. I might say like, oh, the Tory party, they're not going to spend any money on this, are they? And I would do it half jokingly because I don't really want to offend anyone, especially when you've got an audience as small as mine and the fact that you really can run into people. So I don't want to burn any bridges or upset anybody when, I might have a friend that does vote Tory, but I tend not to talk politics with friends anyway because it's just not worth it. They have their views, I have mine. Unless they're being blatantly racist in front of me, then it tends to be that it's something that I just accept is different to them, to me.
Oh, that's interesting. Do you feel hampered by that when you're doing your podcast, that you can't go into these subjects?
No, not really. I mean, I think if I did, then potentially I would have a broader appeal, and there would be obviously more discussions that people not necessarily living in Ramsbottom would enjoy. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I did interview the person that was running for Labour MP at the last election. He was no longer an MP, so I kind of thought it's kind of fair game. I'll get him on the show. And some people have said you should also interview other members of the other party, and they kind of think that it's like I am showing favouritism. So I do need to reach out to them more. And I mean, I do know them because one actually came to my house, not an MT, but he is a councillor, came to my house early on because there was a bit of trouble at the end of the street. And I just thought, this is strange. This isn't really what I expected. So I just said, like, is there anything that can be done about it? And they came round, which is not what you would get in Salford. You wouldn't get the councillor coming round. You would get maybe an email at best. But because it's quite such a rare thing here, he wanted to come round and reassure me that this isn't what Ramsbottom's like. So that was quite nice.
Coming up, Lee Ball talks about his target audience for This Is Rammy, his experience with Facebook ads, podcast sponsorships, the tech he uses to record, edit, and publish, and whether or not he writes his episode before he records. And he'll also share something that is even better than making money with a local podcast. So I mentioned at the start of this episode that Podcast Local is supported by the Satchel Podcast Player, and that it has a very cool local feature. What that is a way for people who listen to podcasts on their Satchel Player to find shows that are produced locally. Now, some of those shows might be locally focused, just like This Is Rammy. Others might have a topical niche, like tech, education, or business, but they're locally produced. If you would like the Satchel Player listeners to discover your local podcast, you can register your show for free at satchelplayer.com. By the way, the man behind the Satchel Player is a local podcaster himself. He's got a show called Let's Talk Jackson that serves southern Mississippi. I interviewed him in episode 3 of Podcast Local, which you can find at podcastlocal.com. If this whole local podcasting thing is stirring your heart and making you wonder if you could do something like this for your community, listen until the end. I've got something that will spark your creativity. All right, let's hear more from Lee Ball from Ramsbottom. Well, let me ask you about your target audience. I'm assuming it's the people who live within Ramsbottom, right?
Yeah, exactly. That was what I started with in mind. It was supposed to be for the person who lives in Ramsbottom who either is not aware of some of the things that are going on, or maybe doesn't have the time, and they're commuting, because you get a lot of people commuting from Ramsbottom because it's such a nice area just outside of a large city that you'll get a lot of people who commute between Ramsbottom and Manchester itself. So there's like half an hour commute there, and that's partly why the episodes are fairly short as well. So I tend to not go over more than half an hour or thereabouts for each episode. But that is kind of my target audience, is the person who lives in Ramsbottom who commutes, and they just want to, come back week in and kind of listen to the latest news or events that are coming up around the town. But equally, I also try and keep it fairly varied, so that if somebody wants to come and actually visit Ramsbottom, they can get kind of a feel for the town. So that's why I want to try and have a varied set of guests and try to ask them questions about Ramsbottom that kind of paint a picture in the listener's mind.
Do you ever reach out in any kind of way to the surrounding area to let them know that you have a podcast about Ramsbottom?
The only thing I think I've done which is close to that is I have put Facebook adverts, and I've narrowed it down to the Bury area, which is a council here. So you've got like Manchester City, and that has lots of little towns within it, and then you've got Bury Council, which has lots of little towns and things within it as well, and Ramsbottom is one of them. So I did kind of narrow it down to a postcode area, which would include Bury and Ramsbottom and things like that. But it's been a while since I did that. I probably spent a couple of £100 on Facebook adverts over maybe a 6-month period. And a lot of that was kind of just trial and error to find out, which type of advert gets people clicking the like button on your Facebook page, which of them go through to the website. And I tended to find that if you promoted your website as opposed to the Facebook page, not only was it cheaper, but they would actually then click through and like your Facebook page anyway. So I tended to specifically do those after a while. But I don't know how many people listen outside of Ramsbottom itself, because all of the stats I get they just say like UK. It doesn't really drill down enough.
Do you use Libsyn?
I use Blueberry.
Blueberry.
So
okay.
Yeah, for a while I was hosting myself because I recently bought a unlimited hosting platform. So I thought, well, let's see how it goes. If it starts getting popular and busy, then I'll migrate my media. And I was just after trying to keep the costs down at the start, because I didn't want to dive in and start spending money on this like podcast hosting when I didn't actually really know what podcast hosting was. How it equated to the size of MP3 and how long the episodes are and things like that. So at the start, it was just self-hosted in a folder on my web host, and that worked fine. To be honest, it probably would continue to work fine now, but I thought, well, it's time to get a little bit more professional, and Blueberry create the PowerPress app, so it was quite easy. The PowerPress plugin for WordPress, and it was quite easy to migrate the media from my existing self-hosted storage to Blueberry, and so that's kind of just what I did. It was that or Libsyn, and Libsyn worked out a little bit more expensive, only like a few pounds more expensive, but I just liked it. It seemed more seamless with Blueberry for me.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. What are your plans for your podcast going forward?
Plans go. I would like to do a lot more. In the short term, I would like to do a lot more interviews, reach out to a lot more local businesses. I have got people that I really want to speak to that are kind of on almost a wish list, that until I feel like I'm more accomplished, I don't really want to approach them. And these are more people like mayors and MPs, members of parliament of the local area. I do have, in March, I had a member of Bury Council contact me and say, they've been looking at the website, we like what you do, we wondered if you wanted to come in and have a chat about one of the areas here. So I've got a meeting with them on the 9th of March. So I've booked a day off work, and I'm going to go and have a meeting in the local civic hall, and we're going to chat to find out how they can essentially publicise themselves a bit more. And from my point of view, I could potentially say, oh yeah, sure, I'm going to charge you X amount of pounds to go and do this. But I much more value the connections that I'm making. So at the moment, I'm just connecting to people, because if it gets to the point where my job, for example, becomes too difficult, obviously I've got another child on the way, if it becomes too difficult to do that commute and get back in time, then it would be nice to have other options. So at some point I might be looking for work elsewhere, so it would be nice to be able to say, we spoke at X date, blah blah blah, I've either now got my own business, or I'm now wondering if you had any work available. So I think that's more valuable than trying to get a £30 or a £40 podcast advertisement right now.
Has anyone reached out to you for sponsorship?
Early on, I had a few people asking about how they can advertise on the podcast, and I think I was a little bit naive quite early, because I thought I was looking at myself and thinking, well, it's going to take me this amount of time to put the advert together, and I probably went in a little bit too high. So I was saying like, yeah, sure, I can have a podcast episode for £100. And so I created like a package, which was essentially the more expensive podcast advert. You would be sponsoring the whole episode yourself. You wouldn't have other sponsors sharing that. And you would also have the branding on the show notes for that particular episode as well. And I think it was just too rich for some people. They were probably testing the water anyway to find out what the options were and find out how we could do it. And I think a lot of the time it was just a little bit too expensive for people. And now I've kind of gotten over the podcast needs to make money kind of route, because I have made so many connections. I have made, friends through the podcast. I am valuing that a lot more. So now I'm a lot more willing to work with people and not even consider talking about charging for things, because although it's going to take me time to do it, like I say, the connections that I'm making are more valuable to me and to my life, really.
So you said you really value that. Can you describe, maybe not with names, but could you describe something where that has happened, that really you're glad you did this podcast because you've made this connection in your community?
Yeah, so early on it was like going out to groups and meeting people, and those particular people, for example, there's a group called the Ramsbottom Community Hub, and I went to the second meeting of that was founded, and I found that a lot of the people there were also in these other groups. So yeah, I've had things like I've backed people's books. So people have had there's a local poet, for example, he's written a storybook, and I backed that on Kickstarter. I went to his launch night here. There's a few people that have offered to babysit, for example, and obviously I now know that they're normal people. They're quite nice. They're not strangers. So anything, having the option, especially with Ramsbottom being, a restaurant town, it's great for us to have that kind of option available, especially when our family used to, they live quite far away anyway. There's a few people I've interviewed where they've just given me things. Like I've had one of the people I interviewed who used to sell very quirky kind of like candle holders and things like that were sourced from places like Africa and like near Mount Everest and things like that, and they were all kind of handmade materials. And so I just, I popped in. She was doing a market stall after I'd interviewed her, and she said like, "Oh, great, nice to meet you." We had, like a hug and stuff, and then she gave me this little gift of a candle holder, and that means more to me than if I'd have tried to get money out of her to be on the podcast. It's the fact that I wasn't looking for anything. It was just she offered it to me, and I saw that, I was quite happy to accept it. I didn't want to refuse it and be, an offender. I've interviewed a local brewer, and he gave me a free bottle of beer while I was sat there doing the interview. I spoke to a local restaurant owner who has children in the same nursery that my child goes to, and my son has actually stayed over at their house as well. Every time we're in their restaurant, they give us like a discount just because they know who we are. So it's that those little things that you don't expect but are quite nice for doing the podcast. And it's actually that person as well was probably the weirdest encounter of doing the podcast, which unless you're doing a local podcast, you kind of won't come across this, or at least unless you're doing a podcast of the size that I do. But I was just out for a walk with my son, walking around the town as we do quite often on weekends, and this must have been a week or two after I'd done the episode of her restaurant that was had recently opened, and I was just stood at the traffic lights waiting to cross with my son, and she was coming out locking up, and I said hello and then turned to cross the road again, and then somebody else came around the corner and said, "Oh, hi, you okay? We heard you on that podcast," and I was like, "Oh, this is a bit weird. What do I do now?" I wasn't sure whether I should turn around and say hello or if I should just keep my head down, so I just stood there and kept quiet. But then the restaurant owner said, "Oh, here's Lee. He does the podcast." So I was just, because it was so early on, I didn't really know what to expect. I didn't kind of expect anybody to recognize me or anything like that, or even be talking about the podcast. I did have somebody recognize my voice in the local barbers. So I was getting my hair cut and my son's, and then after we'd finished, he came over and said, "Are you Lee? Do you do This Is Rammy?" I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Yeah, I recognised your voice." And then, like, after that, I sent him a message on social media and said, "Nice to meet you. Great. I hope to bump into you again sometime." So it's those kind of things that, if I was just doing a technology podcast to the whole world, you wouldn't get that. I mean, you might, if you were quite big and you get like super fans, for example, if you're Leo Laporte, you get people coming to you into your studio. But I kind of get that now and again, just without going anywhere. If I just go out to a local bar or something, and then somebody may have heard of me in there, so it's quite nice. It's a nice feeling.
Well, hey, maybe quickly you could talk about technology to do the podcast. What do you use to record and edit and all of that?
Sure. So at the very, very beginning, I'll just cover the background, is I used to have a condenser microphone because I was told that they are the best. And that went into Audacity. I recorded directly into Audacity and did all of the editing in there. And then I would just upload it onto my website and add it to my feed directly. And that was kind of the whole process there. Now it's slightly different. So I now have the Creative Cloud suite, so I'm using Adobe Audition for editing the podcast. So I have two Samsung Q2U microphones, which are the equivalent of like the AT2100s in America. So they do have USB out and XLR, whereas my previous condenser mic just had the USB out. And I got those microphones because they were on offer. And I bought myself the Surface Pro 4 because my desktop computer was very loud. It was an old gaming machine. It was fine speed-wise. It's just, especially with a condenser microphone, I was competing against the desktop noise and the fans and everything. So I eventually gave up that and bought myself a silent Surface Pro 4. I also have a Zoom H5 recorder, which I picked up fairly cheap. It was £160, I think, whereas normally they're around about 200. Even if you pick one up now, they're about £220. So I saw it. I was looking at potentially getting one, so I picked up one of those anyway. But previously, to do recordings out and about, like on field recordings, I was using my phone, and which is just an Android OnePlus phone. It's got 64 gig of storage, so it's quite a nice handy thing to carry around. And I had a microphone, a small portable USB microphone that would plug into that. And I did a couple of interviews using that microphone until I saw the Zoom H5. And once I got the Zoom, that's when I kind of got these other microphones and really started to hone in on what I was doing. And now, so the whole process is record straight into the microphone. I do record straight into Adobe Audition, which a lot of people say that's crazy. If it crashes, you lose your recording. But then again, I'm only recording about 20 minutes. And I think it's only happened once and I noticed it straight away. So I think I only lost 5 minutes of that. So it's Adobe Audition. And then when I finish the recording, I will export a WAV file. And then I upload that to Auphonic, where I've already got a template which will take my audio in, reduce things like the hiss, boost up, normalize the audio level, because they create the levelator. And it'll sort all of the audio issues out, flatten all the audio out, and it'll also upload it to Blueberry directly. And that's kind of all I need to do then. I also use that to write the ID3 tags. And some diehards will say that because you're using the MP3 codec that's not the good one, it's not the Fraunhofer one, it's the
lame one.
Yeah, the lame encoder. People say that you're going to notice a difference. I've listened and I don't notice a difference. I don't know if enough of a difference. I'm sure they're probably right, But to introduce, because something I used to do for a few episodes was, which I think a lot of people still do, is drag it into iTunes, convert it to an MP3 there. Then I would use MP3 tag application and copy and paste them from a previous episode and make my changes. The time I save now, no one's going to notice that much difference. So if it's going to save me 5 hours over a year, then I'd rather have 5 hours of my year back and have somebody, one person in a million, saying, I can tell a bit of a difference between this file and this one. I'd rather have that and have 5 hours of my life back.
Do you script out your podcast, or do you just talk with talking points off the top of your head?
No, definitely not off the top of my head, because I've made mistakes there, because I start to sound like I've got no idea what I'm doing. So what I will do, my whole process is, so throughout the week, I will take, I'll pay attention to the news. I did used to use a service called Mention, and I had a search for Ramsbottom, and it will throw up websites and things and news feeds and things like that when things will go on. But what I actually ended up doing was finding the RSS feeds for a lot of local news sources. It's like local news and local newspapers and things, and I've plugged them into Hootsuite. So it will tweet out and it will send a Facebook message saying, I've got a little pre-note that says Ramsbottom related news. And it will tweet those out. And if I notice that any of those are good, or if I notice things on Facebook, I'll take a quick note. I try and I'll either put it into Google Keep, which is just like a sticky notes application. I also use Workflowy, but I tend to only use that for future ideas. I don't really use that for episode ideas, but I'll try and put it into a WordPress post just so that I know it's there on the website saved as a draft. And then I'll flesh it out. So I'll look into the article that they were talking about, try and do a little bit of research, and then I'll probably spend about 2 or 3 hours writing some show notes. And it's not exactly word for word, but you can read it as I'm going to say it. So one thing Daniel J. Lewis taught me was that, through listening to his podcast, and I have been I've currently paused my subscription, but I have been a member of his Podcaster Society for the past year. And one of the things he says is write it in your voice. So if you can hear your voice in your head when you're writing your show notes, it makes it a lot easier to read out as you're reading through it, because you're kind of writing it as you would speak it. And yeah, the show notes are fairly comprehensive. You can read them as they are. I would much prefer someone to obviously listen to the podcast. I've kind of got sections in the podcast. So I tend to have a short introduction about, if I've got an interview, it'll be a short introduction about me and what's going on, and here's the interview. I'll try and keep that down to 2 or 3 minutes. But that bit there, I won't have a timestamp on. But then after the interview, I've got a regular feature, which is the Ramsbottom United news, which is end results. So they're our local soccer team, and I'll put a timestamp in that. So when I'm listening back through after I've done all the orphonic processing, just to make sure that it's not broken the file in some strange way, I'll listen through to it. And while I'm doing that, I'll be taking note of the timestamps of when these sections have happened, and I'll add those into the show notes as the last thing I do. And also, originally I was, anybody that liked the Facebook page or liked or followed the Twitter page, I would give them a bit of a shout out. So I know traditionally people would do that for reviews and things on podcasts, but I've had maybe 3 reviews, and I've kind of just got to the point where the only people that are going to want to hear this podcast are going to be the people that hear it from word of mouth anyway. And it doesn't matter how many reviews you've got, because word of mouth is word of mouth. How high a rank in iTunes is not going to affect that. So I've kind of stopped chasing the thing that everybody tells you to go and get, which is lots of reviews and things. And I've just focused on connecting to the people that have liked the social media pages. So I was doing that for a while, and then in the last few weeks I've changed to, I will give a shout out to anybody that has shared the latest episode. The point being that if somebody is listening to the show and they want to hear their name on the episode, then they will probably be more willing to share it to their own social feed, and that kind of gives you the boost in the social media, and it'll make it visible on more people's feeds and things. So I have been doing that recently, and it makes it a bit easier as well, because I do get maybe 10 or 20 people liking the various pages each week, and I don't really want it to be a point where I just sit there and read out 20 or 30 people's names. So I used to just pick out a few of them. And it also felt like everybody that got on with the social media pages early on, it felt a bit like I was missing them out because it was something that I did much later. So they never really got a shout out on the show. So I thought, well, if I do it that you share it, then people can have multiple shout outs each week. Every week they can hear their name. And also it helps me. So that's kind of what I've settled on so far.
Well, as we're wrapping up, is there anything that I have not asked you, but you would really like to say, whether to other local podcasters or just about your show?
I would say if anybody is thinking of starting a podcast, I'd love it if they got in touch, even, just to ask questions or things like that, because I think some people do create podcasts that are local, which are a lot larger than my area, for example. So I think I do have a lot of unique experiences where I might be able to help them. If I was doing a podcast for an area bigger than this, then I think I might struggle, because I feel going to lots of different restaurants and things like that, it would start to get a lot of hard work to try and cover everything. But I think niche down, and I'm not the first to say that, but if you can create a podcast for your street, for example, then why not? What have you got to lose, other than the fact that somebody's going to know where you live, because they'll know what street you live on. But other than that, no, just go for it. I went to the New Media Europe Awards and New Media Europe event a couple of years back, the end of 2015, and I came away with an award for the best travel and tourism podcast in the UK, and I'd only been doing it for 6 months. So just do it and accept that you're going to make a mistake early on.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
No problem. Thank you very much for having me, and best of luck for the rest of Podcast Local.
That's Lee Ball from This Is Rammy, a local podcast for the small town of Ramsbottom in the UK. And you heard him. Get in touch with him if you'd like perspective on podcasting in a small community. His site is thisisrammy.co.uk. That is thisisrammy.co.uk. You can also get in touch with me if you'd like to talk through ideas for local podcasting. I've also got an on-the-go guide. It's called Podcast Local, 7 Ways to Tell the Stories of Your Community. It's free when you sign up for our email newsletter at podcastlocal.com. Again, that's podcastlocal.com. I'm Jason Norris, and thank you for listening, subscribing, and supporting Podcast Local by sharing the show with your friends. I'll talk to you next week.